3 Golden Eagles for War Thunder. Link in the description. Hello you sexy beasts, welcome back to War Thunder. This is the KV-1S, a Soviet Tier 2 battle rating 4.3 heavy tank. Well, you say heavy, but it isn't really a heavy tank. We'll get to that in a bit. Now, the KV-1S features the 76mm ZIS 5 cannon, carrying a total of 114 rounds. This is the upgraded version of the 76mm cannons that the Soviets gets, which is good, but not really. It also features a 7.62mm coaxial machine gun, which can be used to spot targets and maybe snipe the head off out of some open-top German tank destroyer crew. Now the gun handling of this thing is absolutely awful. Like, honestly awful. The horizontal rotation speed is anywhere between 8.4 to 12 degrees per second, depending on your modifications and your crew stats. That is absolutely horrible. This thing takes forever to turn its turret around. On top of that, you also only get a travel between -5 and +25 degrees in the vertical, giving it a good elevation actually. This thing has very good gun elevation, which makes it viable for driving through valleys and shooting at enemies that are ahead of you, on top of you, but make it very hard to crest hills and stuff like that. It's the typical dilemma of the Russian gun depression. On top of that, you also only get between 2.1 and 3 degrees per second travel in the vertical, which makes it very hard to go for those snapshots where you have to adjust for vertical elevation, and of course combined with the absolutely awful horizontal rotation speed makes it actually very hard to fight in fast-paced close-quarter combat. The tank itself weighs 42.5 tons and has a 600 horsepower engine, which gives it a very respectable 14.1 horsepower per ton power to weight ratio. This is very much like a medium tank, and this is exactly what this thing feels like. Now, if you don't know what the KV-1S exactly is, it was an attempt by the Soviet army to make the KV-1 more mobile. Now we have two variants of the KV-1, well, at least in the regular G. We have the KV-1 L11 with the goddamn awful L11 gun, and the KV-1 ZIS 5, which gets the same gun as this thing, but gets more armor. It has 75mm on the sides and about 100mm, over 100mm plates on the front. This thing doesn't get that luxury. The hull armor is about 85mm effective on the flat plate on the front. The upper sloped plate has about 115mm of effective thickness, and the lower glaze is about 75mm. So there you can see the weak spot of the tank is the lower glazes where the driver is. The transmission is actually in the back of this tank, which is nice because, well, you won't have to spend as much time repairing your transmission, but at the same time your driver will get his feet shut off very often. The side armor is about 60mm on the entire side, meaning that you can actually angle this tank quite effectively. Angling it to about 30 degrees, 40 degrees, not more than that, you can get about 115mm effective thickness out of both the frontal plate and the side armor. Do beware, however, that you are exposing your giant fuel tanks on the side. The KV-1S from the side, as with all KV-1s, are huge targets from the side, and they have all their amber racks and fuel tanks on the side, which makes them for quite some fireworks, given that someone catches you, well, from the side. I'm repeating myself a lot. The turret is an interesting story. Now, the flat gun mantle, the flat front of the gun mantle is 90mm thick, which is quite good for this tier. The cheeks are about 85mm thick on the flattest parts, but are very round as well, which makes this thing actually quite trolly, quite bouncy, more so than the regular KV-1 at longer distances, given that the enemy can't really snipe you. However, there are some major weak spots though. Those bolts on the front of the turret, right to either side of the gun mantles, those are only 55mm thick, meaning that pretty much anything at this tier can punch right through that. The sides of the turret are about 75mm thick, which gives you the impression that you can angle the turret effectively, but don't, trust me. I've tried to angle the turret and it doesn't help. It actually exposes your weak spots even more because the sides of the gun metal are also only 55mm thick, making it rather easy to punch straight through them. It also enlarges the area that is flat for the enemy to punch right through, and on top of that it makes it harder for you to get your gun back on target should you need to fire back. It's just better to take the shots from the front. Angle your hull, yes, but don't angle the turret. I did forget to mention the top speed of this thing. It has a 40 km/h top speed, which aren't really seeing in this gameplay. We played more of a stationary, long-range sniping role with the stock shell and the APCR shell and the shrapnel shell, but this thing can move around quite a bit. Which brings me back to the whole topic. This thing isn't really a heavy tank. It doesn't feel like a heavy tank. It feels more like a T-34 with better frontal armor. And this is exactly what this thing essentially is. Now the side armor, you could argue, is actually worse than T-34 because it isn't angled, it's pretty much just flat. But if you angle your tank correctly, you can bounce quite a lot of shots. Now the ammunition of this thing is... it's underwhelming. The stock APH EBC shell gets about 80mm of penetration at close range, trickling down to 63mm at 1 km distance. This shell travels at 665mm per second, has 150 grams of TNT explosive filler, and only a 0.15 meters fuse delay. Now the fuse delay is actually very important in this case. Since the shell has such a short fuse delay, it feels more like a HESH shell than a proper APHE shell. Now, if you don't know what the fuse delay is, essentially it dictates how far your shell would travel through armor or inside the tank before it explodes. In this case, the fuse delay is so short that it pretty much explodes right after penetrating the armor, creating a lot of shrapnel in a cone shape instead of in a spherical shape all around the tank, which gives it that HESH feel. It literally feels like HESH. Besides the stock APHE shell, you also get access to the shrapnel shell. Only the Soviets get the shrapnel shell, and this thing is actually very underrated. I love shrapnel shells. These are essentially like hand grenades that you lob at your enemy. They have 37mm of penetration up close, about 23 if I'm not mistaken, 1 km distance. Travel at about the same speed as the APHE shell, but they have a lot of shrapnel, as the name of the shell indicates, meaning that if you hit light armored targets like anti-air vehicles and stuff like that, they're actually more effective than HE shells at taking those things out. So I always tend to carry around a couple of those to deal with those half tracks, those anti-air vehicles that appear very often in this battle rating in RB. The HE shell is, well, it's an HE shell. It's a 76mm HE shell, essentially useless. Just take a shrapnel shell. Trust me, it's better. The first unlockable shell is a solid APBC shell, which has 105mm of penetration at close range, 69 at 1 km distance, and 680 meters per second muzzle velocity. Slightly faster than the stock shell, but since it doesn't get an explosive filler, it isn't really quite as useful. Of course, the extra penetration is handy, but once you unlock the top shell, which is the APCR shell, you really shouldn't carry the shell anymore. The second unlock is the second APH EBC shell, which pretty much is just a flat upgrade over the stock shell. It gets 98mm of penetration at close range, 77mm at 1 km distance, has a faster muzzle velocity of 680 meters per second, 110 grams of TNT, and a 0.9 meter fuse delay, which means it travels further into the tank before exploding, and even though it has less explosive filler, it does tend to do more damage because the shrapnel just travels around much better. And finally, the top shell is the APCR shell, which is 135mm of penetration at close range and 60mm at 1 km distance. As you can see, the shell loses a lot of penetration over distance, so it isn't really advised to use the shell at anything over 500 meters, but given the 950 meters per second muzzle velocity, it's actually a shell you can snipe with. And that's another problem with the gun of the KV-1S. Now, on top of the awful gun depression, I'm having a really hard time hitting long-range targets with the slow muzzle velocity of the APHE shells. 680 meters per second, even 665 meters per second stock shell is really quite hard. You can actually see in the clips here. I'm having trouble hitting long-range targets. And of course, having the rangefinder helps a lot, especially in RB tanks. And I definitely suggest you to use the rangefinder as much as possible in this tank. The problem is, you waste a lot of time trying to find that range, and by this time, if the enemy spots you, and that is not really hard, because, well, let's be honest here, it's a KV-1 still, it's a huge target. If you can't spot a KV-1 at range, you are blind. You need some glasses. Now, in all this time, they can shoot back at you, and given that this thing doesn't get as much armor as its this 5 KV-1 counterpart, which has much more armor, you can't really take too many shots either. Now, you should be fine against German tanks, against the German medium tanks. Those you can bounce pretty easily. But I found that I've had much trouble against German tank destroyers and most of the British tanks. The British solid shot AP shell seems to have no trouble penetrating right straight through this tank at this battle rating. You seem to get a lot of penetration, which is bad for you. On top of that, the armored German tank destroyer line, like these thugs, and some of the British tanks as well, get enough armor that they can actually just bounce your shots back. And that's really the theme of the KV-1S. It isn't a heavy tank. It just is not a heavy tank. It doesn't feel like a heavy tank. It's very mobile. The armor isn't quite thick enough, and the gun is not a heavy tank gun. It's actually exactly the same gun as you get on the on some of the T-34s, if I'm not mistaken. Well, not quite. I don't think you get this ZIS-5 on the T-34s. But still, the ZIS-5 isn't really that much of an upgrade over the L11 gun. And you're going to have trouble penetrating most of the opposition you face against, especially at longer ranges. Now as for the pros and cons of this tank, of course, the tank itself is very mobile. You can literally use this thing like a medium tank, and you will be doing just fine. And you might be forced into that role, since the low penetration kind of hinders you of facing tanks from the front. You have to kind of get on the sides, on the flanks, and use the fast fire of the gun. This gun fires at between, I think it's 6.9 to 9 seconds reload time. So it has a decent fire rate. It isn't exactly the best, but it's decent enough. You can deal with multiple targets in quick succession, which is good for a medium tank role, of course. The armor is also decent enough, in quotations. There are a lot of tanks at this tier that can punch right straight through you. A big example of that is, for example, the Dicker Max, which is at a 4.3 as well. That thing, the Dicker Max feasts on KV-1S. It penetrates you, it one-shots you every single time. The turret, of course, is both a boon and a curse. Now, it is very rounded, which is good if the enemy can get precision pinpoint shots into front of the turret. But since there is a big weak spot of 55mm on the bolts to the outside of the gun mantled, it is also very easy to penetrate given the accuracy. Especially at close ranges, the enemy tanks will have no problems punching right through your turret. And, well, given the slow horizontal rotation speed and the absolutely piss-poor gun handling, you're going to have some trouble facing tanks at closer ranges. However, there is one big advantage that the KV-1S gets, which is the battle ring itself. At 4.3, it just can't face Tigers. It doesn't face Tigers, which is awesome, because let's be honest here, this thing couldn't face Tigers. It doesn't have the gun penetration, neither does it have the armor to even compete with a Tiger. So it does get that benefit over its ZIS-5 counterpart, the next KV-1 down the line. Since that gets the same gun, has a bit more armor, but since it gets the same gun, it can't really penetrate Tigers, and, well, this thing doesn't face Tigers. However, it has much more drawbacks than it has benefits. The gun handling is awful, the penetration is awful, it is very weak to British tanks and to German tank destroyers. The Dicker Max just completely feasts on this thing. The turret has a massive weak spot. It has huge fuel tanks and ammo racks which just blow up instantly when something hits them. And of course, it suffers from the heavy tank designation. Having the heavy tank designation in RB means that you probably aren't going to be able to spawn anything else once you spawn in the KV-1S. You just waste too many respawn points. And as such, this concludes the review of the KV-1S. Suggested playstyle? Just honestly play it like a T-34. It's essentially a T-34 with more frontal armor. It's exactly what this thing is. So, guys, hopefully if you have enjoyed this video, leave me a like rating if you did, dislike if you didn't. If you're new around here, you can also subscribe. It is, of course, completely free, and you're going to get 3 videos a week on War Thunder. This time around, there's no voting going on, because, well, the next 2 videos are already predetermined. The next video is probably going to be on either the M60 or the T10M, and on that video, you will be able to vote for a new vehicle. But until then, I will see you next time. My name is MikeGoesBoom. Thank you very much for watching.
You can lift your head up to the sky, take a deeper breath and give it time. You can walk the path among the lies with your shattered frame.